The Wyoming sky the morning she spent her last 2 coins was the color of old pewter, flat, unforgiving, the kind of sky that didn't promise anything. 60 people sat in that room. 60 people who had heard the name Iron Curtain and knew what it meant. When Lot 9 walked through that door shackled, marked, looking at the crowd like a man who had already counted every exit, not one of them moved to bid. Not one. Then a woman in a faded blue work shirt reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 silver coins. The last 2 she had in the world. The gavel came down. Outside, 3 riders watched the courthouse door from the south road, waiting. Because some debts, the kind written in blood and carved into fence posts, didn't end at an auction. They were just beginning. The Wyoming sky the morning Nora Hale spent her last 2 coins was the color of old pewter, flat, unforgiving. The kind of sky that didn't threaten rain so much as remind you that water was something other people had. She sat on the porch steps with a mug of coffee gone cold in her hands, not drinking it, just holding the weight of it. The ceramic was chipped at the rim where her father had knocked it against the pump handle 2 winters back, and she had never replaced it because replacing things cost money, and money was the one crop the Hale land had stopped producing entirely. 30 cattle in the far pasture. There had been 300 when her father was alive. She didn't let herself look at the fence line for too long, because looking meant counting, and counting meant acknowledging how many posts had pulled loose from the cracked earth, how many sections of wire had gone slack and tangled and given up the way wire gave up when nobody had time to tend it. She didn't have the days, or the labor, or the particular brand of optimism required to believe that one woman with calloused hands and a bad right knee could fix 40 broken fence posts before the bank came calling, which it would. 4 months. The letter said 4 months. And the letter was still on the kitchen table, face down, as though not seeing the words could slow the calendar. The 2 coins were in her shirt pocket. She could feel them through the cotton, small and solid and worn smooth by decades of Hale hands turning them over. Her grandmother had carried them from the Missouri settlements during the crossing, pressed against her sternum every night, until she found land worth stopping for. Her mother had kept them in a tobacco tin on the bedroom shelf, taking them out on certain evenings to show Nora, when Nora was old enough to understand, that some objects carried weight beyond their face value. Nora had put them in her pocket the morning her mother died and hadn't taken them out since. Today she was going to spend them. Or try to. The debt auction in Millstone started at 10, and she needed to be there before they ran through the early lots. Before the good labor was taken by ranchers with actual money to bid. What she needed was someone who could dig, mend wire, work a pump mechanism, someone strong enough to do the work her body knew how to direct, but couldn't always perform alone. Not on the scale the Hale spread demanded. Not anymore. She set the coffee mug on the step beside her and looked at the coins in her palm. Her grandmother had called them lucky. Nora had spent the better part of 3 years trying to determine what exact lucky meant in practice. She got up, went inside, put on her better work shirt, the blue one, which was still faded but faded more evenly than the others, pulled her hair back, put on her hat, went out to the corral where Cinder stood at the gate with the patient expression of an animal that had seen enough human trouble to have stopped being surprised by any of it. He was a bay gelding with a white star on his forehead and a personality that could charitably be described as particular. He didn't like strangers, he didn't like sudden movements, he didn't like the smell of Millstone Creek after a dry summer, which limited his useful radius considerably, but he was steady under a rider in a way that mattered more than temperament. And he had belonged to her father before her. Would you treat them with kindness? And she couldn't have sold him even in the worst months when selling him would have paid 2 mortgage installments and bought her 6 months of breathing room. She bridled him and mounted without ceremony and pointed him toward the road south. Millstone Creek sat in the valley between 2 long ridges, the kind of town that looked from a distance like something dropped there by accident and never quite relocated itself. Main Street was 8 blocks of weathered timber and false fronts, leaning slightly into each other the way people leaned at funerals, bearing collective weight. The general store, the feed supply, the saloon with its perpetually optimistic sign, the land office, the bank, which was the only building on the street with fresh paint, and that told you something about where the money in Millstone actually lived, and at the far end, the courthouse. 2 stories of limestone block that represented the territorial government's most substantial investment in the region, complete with a clock tower that had stopped working 3 years ago and never been repaired because the man who knew how to repair it had moved to Cheyenne. Nora tied Cinder at the rail outside the courthouse and went in. She was still tying the reins when she heard it. 2 men on the courthouse steps, standing close, voices pitched low in the way men pitched their voices when they thought they were being quiet but weren't. She caught the words without trying, hard not to. Silas Iron Curtain. Auction. She didn't stop walking, but she slowed enough to catch the shape of it. Croft was having someone watched at the auction today. Iron Curtain was liquidating one of their actual crew, not an associate, not a man who'd done a job or 2 on the edges, someone who'd been inside the organization long enough to know things worth knowing. The name Iron Curtain had been moving through Millstone County for 2 years before Broken Spur. But Broken Spur was when it stopped being a rumor and started being a weight that people carried in their chests without knowing exactly when they'd picked it up. She knew what Broken Spur meant. Everybody within 40 miles knew what Broken Spur meant. Thomas Marsh, his wife Della, his brother's family. 7 people. One night. The homestead burned and the words Iron Curtain carved into the fence post at the property line like a signature. She had known Thomas Marsh the way you knew people in a county this size, which was to say she had bought seed corn from him one season and shaken his hand twice, and knew him by the quality of his handshake, which was the kind that meant what it said. Her father had respected him. That was enough. She went inside. The crowd was already settled into the wooden benches, maybe 60 people. The ranching families from the surrounding valley, some merchants from town, a few faces she didn't recognize who had the look of speculators, men who came to debt auctions the way other men came to livestock sales, with sharp eyes and a professional detachment from the human cost of what was happening in front of them. Nora found a seat near the back. The room smelled of sawdust and tobacco, and the specific anxious sweat of people watching other people's misfortune and measuring it privately against their own. Judge Calhoun presided from the front bench. He was a lean man with silver hair and the expression of someone who had made peace with the unpleasantness of his duties by filing them under necessary. He moved through the early proceedings with minimal commentary, reading each lot's details in a voice that was neither cruel nor kind, simply official. The gavel was a sound Nora associated with finality. She had heard it too many times in the past 3 years on matters she couldn't control. The early lots moved quickly. Lot 1, a farmer from the south end of the territory. Lot 2, a younger man caught without territorial papers. They went for $8, $11. Reasonable sums for reasonable stretches of labor. The buyers assessed with the calculating eye of people who needed work done and had stopped being embarrassed about the method of acquisition. She kept her hand over her shirt pocket where the 2 coins sat. Conversations ran in low currents beneath the proceedings. To her left, a man she knew by sight as someone who ranched the Eastern Ridge was talking to the woman beside him in the voice men used when they thought they were whispering but weren't. She caught it in pieces. Something in this lot. Iron Curtain. Not just connected, actually inside. The woman made a small sound. The man settled back, said the word Broken Spur, and the room did what rooms did when that name entered them. Not loud, not obvious, more like a held breath, collective and sudden, a dozen conversations pausing at once. The way birds stopped singing before a storm. Nora felt it move through the benches like a cold current. Broken Spur, 8 months ago. The Marsh family gone in a single night. The homestead burned. Iron Curtain carved into the post. The territorial marshal's office had been investigating since, had sent notices and conducted interviews, and come up with nothing anyone was willing to put their name to in court. Lot 8 finished. The room shifted. Judge Calhoun looked down at his papers for a moment longer than he had looked at any of the previous lots. A small thing. The kind of pause that communicated more than any announcement. Then he set the papers flat, squared them against the bench surface, and lifted his voice. Lot 9. The man who came through the side door was tall, more than 6 feet, lean in the way that came from years of hard use rather than deprivation. Dark hair past his collar, several days of beard. His clothes were rough, the shirt torn at the shoulder, in a way that didn't come from snagging on wire, but from something more deliberate. Iron shackles at his wrists and ankles, the chain between them just long enough for a shortened walking stride, but it was the mark that held every eye in the room. The shirt was torn open at the chest, whether by intent or circumstance Nora couldn't tell, and through the gap the tattoo was visible. She had seen the design on wanted notices, a sketch of it anyway, but the sketch hadn't prepared her for the reality. A series of jagged black lines suggesting a veil being torn apart, the edges deliberately rough, the lines thick and permanent in a way that spoke of commitment or coercion, or both. It sat on his collarbone and upper chest like a declaration. The room went quiet, the way rooms went quiet when something actually dangerous entered them. Nora was in the back row, which meant she had the full picture, not just the man on the platform but the crowd reacting to him. The man to her left had gone completely still. The woman beside him had reached for her husband's arm without looking. Two men in the front row had shifted their weight toward the aisle. Judge Calhoun's hand rested on the surface of his bench, with the deliberate stillness of a man reminding himself of his authority. Lot 9. Calhoun's voice had recovered some of its official steadiness. Arrested on charges of criminal association and failure to provide territorial identification. Sentenced to be determined by the purchaser according to the labor of outstanding obligations. Opening bid is $5. Silence. Not the conversational silence between announcements, the real kind, the kind that had physical weight. Nora looked at the man on the platform. She looked the way she had learned, to look at things she was trying to understand. Not at what was obvious, but at what was underneath the obvious. The tattoo was obvious. The shackles were obvious. The way the whole room had pulled back from him like he was a source of heat was obvious. What she looked at instead was his eyes. They were moving across the crowd in a slow, controlled sweep that had nothing frantic or desperate about it. The eyes of someone taking inventory, not of threats exactly, but of the room's composition, its exits, its weight distribution. When they reached her row and passed over her and continued their sweep, she had the strange sensation of being assessed and filed and moved past in the space of a single second by someone whose assessment apparatus was considerably more developed than her own. And in the fraction of a moment when his gaze had rested on her face, she had seen what she hadn't expected. Not cruelty, not calculation. Something older and much more tired. The specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something heavy for so long that the weight had become their natural posture. She had seen that look before. She saw it in her own mirror on the worst mornings. $4. Calhoun's voice had developed a slight rough quality at the edges. Surely someone can make use of a capable man. $4 for the lot. Nothing. The room breathed in unison and offered nothing. $3 then. $3. I need a bid on lot 9. Nora's hand was in her shirt pocket before her mind had fully caught up to what her hand was doing. The coins were smooth against her fingers. Her grandmother's luck. Her mouth opened. $2 silver. 60 people turned to look at her. She had the experience of being the sudden and complete focus of a room, something she had not sought and could not now undo. The man to her left was staring with the expression of someone watching another person walk toward a cliff edge and trying to calculate whether to shout or just watch. The woman beside him had released her husband's arm and was simply staring with her mouth slightly open. Nora kept her eyes on Judge Calhoun. Calhoun looked at her, then at the 2 coins she held up, then at the crowd, then at the platform where the man called Lot 9 stood with his shackled wrists held at a neutral position in front of him. Watching the entire scene with an expression Nora couldn't read from where she sat, except to say that whatever it wasn't contempt. $2 silver from Miss Hale. Calhoun's voice had recovered its official steadiness, bolstered by evident relief at having a bid at all. Do I have any further offers? The silence this time was different. It had the quality of a decision being made collectively and without discussion. Calhoun raised his gavel. Sold to Miss Hale. The crack of it against the bench surface hit her in the sternum. She stood, made her way to the front of the room through a crowd that parted not out of respect but out of something closer to the instinct to stay clear of whatever was about to happen to her. She placed the $2 Morgan in Calhoun's outstretched palm, and felt the absence of them in her hand like a small severance, her grandmother's luck passing to someone else's keeping. Calhoun produced a heavy iron key and held it out along with the chain leash attached to the wrist shackles. The prisoner is your legal responsibility for the duration of his service. The territory assumes no liability. Nora took the key, did not take the chain, walked to the platform where the man stood. Up close, he was younger than he'd looked from across the room. 30, maybe a year or two past that. The scar his left jaw was older than the beard, a clean line that had healed well. The kind of scar that came from someone who knew how to hold still while someone else did the work. Hilt calluses on his right hand. The way he stood with his weight slightly forward on the balls of his feet. His jaw tightened as she approached, not in hostility but in the specific wariness of a man who had learned to read every approaching figure as a variable. She understood that reflexively. She'd developed her own version of it over 3 years of managing alone. "What do people call you?" she asked. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the room. That quick, efficient assessment. Except this time she was close enough to see the specific quality of attention in it. Callum. First name? Callum is sufficient. She fitted the key to the wrist shackles and turned it. The iron fell open. She caught it before it hit the floor and handed it back to Judge Calhoun, who looked at her with an expression balanced precisely between professional neutrality and personal alarm. Callum rubbed his wrists, not making a production of it, just working the circulation back with the methodical efficiency of someone attending to a practical problem. "I'm Nora Hale. Hale Ranch is an hour north." She glanced at Cinder through the courthouse window, still tied at the rail with his opinion of the whole situation expressed through the angle of his ears. "You'll ride behind me. The horse doesn't like strangers, so let him come to you." Something moved across Callum's face, not quite amusement. The shadow of it, maybe. All right. They walked out of the courthouse together into the afternoon light, and Nora was acutely aware of the town watching. The faces at windows. The man in front of the feed supply who had stopped moving entirely. 2 women on the far side of the street who stood with the frozen posture of people who had made eye contact with something unexpected and were waiting to see what it did next. She untied Cinder and turned to find that Callum had stopped about 6 feet from the horse and was simply standing there, hands loose at his sides, making no move toward the animal. Cinder's ears went to that sharp forward angle that meant he was deciding something. A snort. Then he took 2 steps toward Callum, stretched his neck and pushed his nose against the man's open palm. Nora had owned that horse for 11 years. She had never once seen him do that with someone he'd just met. Callum said something very low, almost inaudible. A few syllables she couldn't parse from where she stood. Whatever it was, Cinder settled his weight back onto all 4 feet and stopped looking like he was calculating an exit strategy. She mounted. Callum took her offered hand and swung up behind her, with the ease of someone who had spent a significant portion of his life on horseback, settling his weight with care so as not to throw Cinder's balance. And they rode north out of Millstone Creek with the eyes of the town tracking them until the first bend in the road took them out of sight. The hours ride passed in silence that Nora found she didn't need to fill. Callum sat behind her with the controlled stillness of someone who had learned to be still in situations considerably more tense than a horseback ride through Wyoming grassland. She could feel the warmth of him at her back, and the slight adjustment of his weight when Cinder navigated the rocky stretch before the creek crossing. He didn't grip her for balance, didn't put his hands on her, until the moment Cinder jumped a downed branch, and then only briefly at her waist, and then the hands were gone again. When they crested the ridge that looked down over the Hale spread, Nora felt the habitual squeeze of shame that came with seeing the place through new eyes. The fence line visible from up here with its obvious gaps and tilted posts. The barn with its missing shingles. The kitchen garden gone entirely to weeds. The whole thing looking exactly like what it was, which was a property that had been managed by one person past the point at which one person could manage it. "That's it," she said. Callum looked. She couldn't see his face from this angle, but she felt the pause, the moment of taking it in. "Good bones," he said. Not an assessment meant to comfort her, just an observation delivered in the flat, practical tone of someone who looked at structures and land the way Nora looked at horses. Reading what was underneath the current condition, she had the sense he was actually seeing something she'd stopped being able to see. The way you stopped seeing a room you'd lived in long enough. They rode down. Nora tied Cinder at the water trough, and Callum dismounted with the same fluid efficiency she'd noted before. The shackles gone now, his movement unrestricted in a way that made her momentarily register the change in what he was. No longer a man in chains, just a man, a large one, standing in her yard with the Iron Curtain tattoo visible at his collarbone where the shirt was torn. She showed him the lean-to behind the barn. 3 walls, a roof, a cot her father had used during calving season, basic. She watched his face for disappointment or calculation and found neither. He looked at the space the way he'd looked at the ranch from the ridge, assessing its utility. There's a pump behind the house. She kept her voice even and practical. Outhouse beyond that. I'll bring blankets and a lamp after supper. I'll need to know where the tools are kept, not a question. An immediate turn toward the work. She showed him the tool storage in the barn, her father's collection of hand tools kept with the organized precision of a man who believed that a tool properly cared for lasted a lifetime. Most of them had. Nora watched Callum move through the space, picking things up and setting them back, not randomly but with the specific attention of someone cataloging what was present and what was missing. Fence wire, she said. End of the loft. Pump seal, I don't know what condition it's in, I'll look at it tomorrow. He moved to the barn doors and looked out at the property with the same quality of attention he'd brought to everything since they'd arrived. Systematic and direct. What's the water situation? The well's been declining for 6 months. I've been supplementing from the spring in the far pasture, but it's running lower every week. He nodded once, looked at the pump visible around the corner of the house, then back at the fence line. She could see him sequencing the problems in order of urgency the way she did when she walked the property every morning. Starting with what would fail first. She had expected some kind of negotiation about the terms. Some assertion of self or resentment about the circumstances that had brought him here. There was none of that. Just the forward-facing focus of someone who had already moved past whatever had happened in that courthouse and was now looking at the work in front of him. She left him to it and went inside to start supper. Through the kitchen window, she watched him crossed to the pump behind the house, work it a few times with his ear cocked, listening to the mechanism rather than just operating it, then crouched to look at the base of the pump housing. He stood, walked to the barn, came back with a lamp, and went around to the back of the pump structure, and crouched again. She made cornbread and beans, the supper she made when she couldn't afford to think about supper, and brought a plate to the lean-to, with a mug of water and blankets from the cedar chest. Callum wasn't in the lean-to. She found him at the fence line nearest the barn, driving posts by lamplight, the rhythm of it steady and precise. He'd found her father's post driver in the barn tool storage. The post he was replacing had been leaning at a dangerous angle for 3 months. She had looked at it every day for 3 months. He took the plate and ate standing, looking at the next section of fence that needed work. Nora stood beside him in the dark for a moment with no clear reason to still be there except that she was. He handed the empty plate back without comment. She went inside. That night she lay in her parents' bed, which she had moved into a year ago, because keeping her childhood room while the master room sat empty seemed like a waste she couldn't afford. She looked at the ceiling and listened to the quiet of the ranch and tried to determine what she had done today. She had spent the last of her liquid assets on a man connected to the Iron Curtain organization. The ranch had a post driver working in the dark beyond her barn window. The 2 coins were gone and the gavel had come down, and now whatever came next was coming regardless of how she felt about it. She was in the specific shallow drift of near sleep when she heard it. A sound from outside. The pump being worked. She looked at the window, past 2 in the morning by the sky. She dressed and went out with her own lamp. Found Callum crouched at the pump housing, with several components disassembled on a cloth on the ground beside him, working by the light of his lamp set on the edge of the trough. He didn't startle at her approach. Whether he'd heard her coming or simply had the reflex control not to react to unexpected sounds, she couldn't tell. Couldn't sleep. He didn't look up. Figured I'd check the filter housing while I had the time. Nora stood beside the disassembled pump in her work clothes at 2 in the morning. Looking at a man she'd purchased approximately 12 hours ago taking apart her water supply by lamplight. He held up a corroded cylinder, small, maybe 6 inches long, that she wouldn't have recognized as the source of her problems, even if she'd known to look for it. This is why your output's been declining. Nothing wrong with the mechanism itself. Can you fix it? Need to fabricate a new filter. Can do it tomorrow from materials in your barn. Have full pressure back by evening. He set the component down with care. You should go back inside. No need for both of us to be awake. Nora stood there another moment, looking at the disassembled pump laid out with organized precision. The work of a man who had been thinking about this problem since he first touched the handle that afternoon, and had simply been waiting for the right moment to address it. "Why?" she said. He looked up then, a real look, not the cataloging sweep from the courthouse. "Why what? Why does it matter to you whether my pump works?" Callum was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Then, you traded the last thing you had for a chance your ranch would survive. That's not a small thing." He looked back at the components on the cloth. "Least I can do is make sure the water works." Nora went back inside. She lay in the dark and thought about that, and somewhere in the thinking she fell asleep for real. The next morning she woke before dawn to a sound she had not heard in nearly a year. Water moving freely through the pump housing with full pressure, the sound of it carrying in the dry morning air all the way to the bedroom window. She stood on the porch with hot coffee and listened to it and felt something that had been clenched in her chest for a long time release one small degree. Callum was already at the fence line. The post from last night was in. He was 3 posts down from it and moving steadily. The day settled into work the way days on a ranch did, not by schedule but by urgency. Each task generating the next in a chain that started with the most critical problem and worked outward. Nora spent the morning on the far pasture, checking the cattle, a count and visual on each one, the kind of survey her father had done every day of his ranching life without fail. She found them clustered at the small spring, which was noticeably lower than her last visit 3 days ago. She stood at the bank of it and did the math she'd been avoiding, timelines and water demands, and arrived at the same answer she'd been arriving at for weeks. The spring would be insufficient by late November. The Hale spread needed its well running at capacity, which it now was. She rode back toward the house and found Gus Farley waiting at the fence line that bordered the north pasture. Gus was 55 and had ranched the spread north of the Hale land for 22 years. He was the one who had helped Nora move her parents' furniture after the fever took them both, had showed up on a Wednesday morning without being asked, spent the day moving heavy things, said nothing about grief that she hadn't specifically invited him to say, which had been exactly the right thing to do. She had never forgotten it. He rode a gray mare he'd owned a decade and had the weathered, straight-backed posture of a man who had spent enough time in Wyoming winters to have all the unnecessary movement calibrated out of him. He was looking at the fence line, at the new post standing straight and firm in the dry earth. Then he looked at Nora. Then at the barn where Callum was visible through the open doors, working on something she couldn't identify from here. "Heard you made quite a purchase yesterday." Not unkind, the voice of a man choosing his words with care. "I needed help." Gus looked at the fence line again, looked at Callum. His expression moved through something complicated. "Nora," he stopped. "All right, I'm not going to tell you what you already know about the situation you've put yourself in, but I need you to know that Ruth and I are a 40-minute ride north, and if anything goes wrong here, you send word immediately. Not eventually. Immediately. I know where you live, Gus. Do you have a firearm accessible?" She had her father's rifle in the bedroom, which was where it had been for 3 years, which was not exactly accessible in the sense Gus meant. "I'll move it." Gus looked at her for another long moment. "Your father was the most capable judge of character I ever knew. I'm choosing to assume you got that from him." He gathered his reins. "That fence looks better than it did before." He rode north without turning back. Nora moved the rifle to the kitchen that afternoon, propped it in the corner near the back door, loaded. She was checking the load when she heard hoofbeats from the road and looked up through the window to see 4 riders coming up the approach at a pace that was neither urgent nor leisurely. The specific pace of people who believed they had the right to arrive wherever they were going. The riders pulled up in the yard. 4 men, well mounted. The horses showing the quality of animals that cost money and were regularly fed. The man in front was broad across the shoulders, with gray at his temples and an angular fit that gave nothing away. He moved his horse through the yard with the easy authority of someone accustomed to walking into spaces and having them accommodate him. Nora stepped out onto the porch. "Miss Hale." The broad man touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, the minimum gesture of courtesy. "Name's Silas Croft. Looking for a friend of mine. Heard you might have taken on a new hand recently. I have a hired man." Nora's hands were at her sides. "He's working. Mind if we say hello?" "I mind everything about why you're here, Mr. Croft, which is something I think we both know the shape of. If you have business with me directly, say it." Croft smiled, the smile that didn't move his eyes. Just catching up with an old acquaintance. No trouble intended. Then I'll pass along your greetings. Good day. From the corner of her eye she saw Callum come out of the barn. He had a coil of fence wire in one hand which he set down with controlled care, a man putting something down in order to have his hands free. He'd come from the side of the barn, not the front, which meant he'd heard the horses and moved position before coming out, which meant he hadn't been inside the barn when the riders arrived, which meant he'd been watching from somewhere else. Croft looked at Callum for a moment. Something passed between them in that look that Nora couldn't fully read, the specific communication of people who had a history that predated and would outlast the present conversation. Weston. Croft's voice had shifted. Still level, different quality underneath. It's been a while. Callum's voice was entirely flat, not unfriendly, not the opposite. Simply stripped of anything that could be used. Croft, you've made an interesting choice of situation. I'm working. Croft looked at the fence line, at the new posts, at the repaired pump housing visible around the corner of the barn. Something moved through his expression that Nora could only categorize as assessment. Then, we should talk. We are talking. Croft let that sit. His three companions had stayed on their horses, which Nora now registered as a deliberate arrangement, keeping them high, giving Croft space to conduct whatever this was on his own terms. In private, Nora stepped forward, not a large movement, just enough to be clearly positioned between Croft and the yard. Mr. Croft, you're on Hale land and you weren't invited. My hired man is working. If you have something to say to him, you can say it with me standing here, or you can ride back the way you came. Croft looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating who he was actually dealing with. From the north fence line came the sound of hoofbeats. Gus Farley's grey mare. Gus coming into view on his late afternoon check of the property line. Gus was not riding toward them, but he was visible, and he had the long-range awareness of a man who had worked this land long enough to notice when something in his field of vision was wrong. Croft looked at Gus, back at Nora, at Callum. His smile didn't change. He touched his hat brim again with the 2-finger minimum and turned his horse without hurry. His three companions followed. Nora stood on the porch and watched them go until they were through the fence gate and onto the road south and out of sight around the first bend. Gus had not come closer. He'd simply been present, watching, and now he continued his property line check as though nothing had interrupted it. The practiced discretion of a man who knew when to appear and when to disappear. She turned. Callum had not moved from where he'd come out of the barn. His hands were loose at his sides. His eyes were still on the road south, tracking the diminishing dust trail. Who is he? Not quite a question. More like the shape of one. Silas Croft. Callum watched the dust, iron curtain. He runs the collection side. Make sure the people who ought to stay quiet stay quiet. The words landed with a specific weight. And you? I'm not one of the people who stayed quiet. He looked at her then. That's why he's here. Nora held his gaze. There were questions behind that statement that she wasn't ready to ask yet. Not with the dust of Croft's horses still hanging in the evening air over the south road. She would ask them. But not tonight. The rifle is in the kitchen, she said. Good. She went inside. Put beans on to simmer. Set the rifle against the corner near the back door, where she could reach it in 4 steps from anywhere in the kitchen. Then she stood at the window and watched the last light go out of the sky over Wyoming, and listened to the sound of Callum working the fence line in the dark. That night she couldn't sleep in the particular way she couldn't sleep before something she couldn't name. Which was when she got up and took the lamp and went out to check on Cinder the way she did when she was restless. The fresh marks in the mud by the pump housing hadn't been there that morning. 4 separate boot prints, different tread from any boot on the property. Coming from the west fence line and going back the same way. Someone had been in the yard while they slept. Whoever it was had stood at the pump housing long enough to leave weight impressions in the soft ground around it and then left without touching anything, without breaking anything. Just looked, just measured, just calculated the distance between the pump and the house and the barn and the lean-to. Nora crouched beside the prints in the lamplight and felt the cold settle around her that had nothing to do with the Wyoming night air. She thought about her grandmother's coins. Lucky, the family had said. She stood up and took the lamp back inside, and sat in the kitchen chair, closest to the rifle, and stayed there, until the gray began at the horizon, and the Wyoming morning arrived with its usual indifference to whatever the night had brought. 3 days after Silas Croft rode off the Hale property, Nora found the handkerchief, She was gathering laundry from the line behind the house, the kind of task that required no thought, and therefore left the mind free to inventory everything that needed worrying about, which in her current situation was a substantial list. The morning was cold and bright, the Wyoming sky doing its occasional impression of something benign, and she was unpinning Callum's work shirts from the line because his had dried first and she'd taken them down alongside her own without thinking about it, until the shirts were in her hands. And then not thinking about it became very conscious thinking about it. The handkerchief was in the breast pocket of the second shirt. She felt it before she saw it. A folded square of cotton that had been washed at some point but not recently, and when she pulled it out to set it aside before folding the shirt, she saw the staining, old blood, brown and dark and thoroughly set into the fabric. The kind that stopped trying to come out after the first washing and had simply become part of the cloth. The handkerchief itself was plain. No monogram, no distinguishing marks, just a square of cotton that had been folded and refolded along the same creases so many times that the fabric had gone thin at the fold lines. She stood at the clothesline with the laundry basket at her feet and the stained handkerchief in her hand, and made herself breathe at a regular pace. She was still holding it when Callum came around the corner of the barn with the fence pliers, and stopped. He looked at her hands, at what was in them. Something shifted in his face. Not alarm exactly. More the specific expression of a man watching something he'd kept private become no longer private. Adjusting to the new condition of things, Nora held it up. Whose blood? The pause was long enough that she thought he was going to find a way around the question. Then he crossed to where she stood and took the handkerchief from her, with the care of someone handling something that had weight beyond its material. He looked at it in his own hands for a moment. Mine, he said, and Della Marsh. The name landed between them like a stone into still water. Della Marsh, wife of Thomas Marsh, sole survivor of Broken Spur, the woman whose name had been on every territorial marshal's notice for 8 months. The witness who had allegedly been found wandering the road, in shock and subsequently recovered at a relation's home outside of Casper. The woman whom Iron Curtain had every reason to ensure stayed either silent or unreachable. Nora sat down on the chopping block because her legs made that decision without consulting her. She set the laundry basket aside. Tell me. And he did, not the way Nora had expected. Not a clean account with a beginning and a middle and an end, but the way people told things they'd carried too long. Sideways and in pieces. Occasionally out of sequence, stopping to find words for things that had resisted language since the night they happened. She let him tell it the way it needed to be told and did not interrupt. The Marsh homestead. The plan that had assumed an empty house. The family that had come home early from a cancelled trip to Casper. Thomas Marsh's wagon, pulling up to his own yard in the dark, and every calculation of that night immediately wrong. The shooting that started before Callum understood it was starting. By the time it ended, by the time he understood the full scope of what had happened in those compressed and terrible minutes, it was already over for most of the family. Della Marsh had gone into the root cellar when the first shot was fired. She had the instinct of a woman who had spent 20 years on the frontier, where the first shot was never the last, and she had stayed quiet in the dark under the floor of her house while her family died above her. When Croft's men found the cellar door, Callum stepped in front of it, not with a weapon, with himself, his body between the cellar door and the men who wanted it opened, and his voice saying no in the flat, authoritative tone of a man who was not requesting agreement. It had not been without cost. The scar along his left jaw was from that night. He had gotten Della Marsh out of the cellar and onto a horse, and ridden with her to the nearest territorial patrol station at Red Rock Crossing, a 2-hour ride in the dark. He had knocked on the station door and told the man who answered that there was a woman who needed help, and he had not waited to see what happened next, because waiting would have meant being there when the patrol identified who had just knocked on their door. He had taken the handkerchief from Della's hands when she tried to use it to stop his bleeding, had kept it since. Nora looked at him when he finished. She was trying to locate a frame large enough to hold everything she'd just been given, and finding that the frames she had available were inadequate. The man sitting across the chopping block from her had an Iron Curtain tattoo on his chest, and 8 months of running from the consequences of the night at Broken Spur. And he had also put himself between a cellar door and the men who wanted it opened. Both of those things were true. They had to be held at the same time. and she was not yet sure what to do with the holding. Della Marsh, Nora chose her words with care. Does she know who you are? She knows what I look like. The handkerchief was folded back along its established creases. The motion automatic. She knows my first name. Whether she connected it to anything official, I don't know. Where is she now? Last I heard, Casper, staying with her sister's family. Nora stood up, picked up the laundry basket, set the handkerchief on top of the folded shirts. Keep working on the north fence. I need to think. She went into the house and stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table and did what she'd said she'd do. The situation as it currently stood. A man connected to the Iron Curtain attack on Broken Spur was living in her lean-to and fixing her fence line. Silas Croft knew he was here. Croft had not come to that knowledge by accident. Someone in Millstone had talked, probably more than one someone. The debt auction had not been a private transaction. The situation as it additionally stood, that same man had risked his life to pull Della Marsh out of a cellar and get her to safety. A fact that exactly no one in the territorial marshal's office knew about because he'd fled before anyone thought to ask. Nora moved to the shelf above the fireplace where her father kept his correspondence box. A flat tin with a latch. Inside were the documents she'd sorted through in the weeks after his death. Land deeds, receipts, a handful of letters. And at the bottom, the business card that Marshal Jonas Pruitt had left during his condolence visit, 8 months after her father died. A courtesy call to the ranches in the territory. She hadn't thrown it away, because she had a habit of keeping things that might someday be useful. Her father had called that frugal. Her mother had called it hoarding. Nora had called it practical. She set the card on the table. Harwick Station was a 6-hour ride. She stood at the table and looked at the card and the handkerchief and did the math, the kind that took into account not just numbers, but the nature of the people involved and the direction the situation was already moving. Regardless of what she chose, Croft was going to come back. He was going to come back with more men or with better timing or with both. And Callum could not run in a direction that led anywhere useful because every direction had his face attached to it. His face had a known tattoo. The territorial notices had been out for 8 months. The only direction that led somewhere was through. Nora folded Marshal Pruitt's card and put it in her shirt pocket. She went back to the barn to tell Callum she was riding to Harwick Station. She expected an argument. What she got instead was a very long look, the kind that was trying to determine something about her intentions, and then a short nod. Pruitt's a fair man, Callum said. Don't volunteer more than he asks for. I'll decide what I volunteer. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one. Yes, he said, you probably will. She left before first light the next morning, told Gus Farley she was riding to the station on ranch business, and asked him to check the far pasture in the afternoon. Gus asked no questions, which was one of his best qualities, and said he'd have his man ride the perimeter. The ride to Harwick Station was long enough to think through every version of how the conversation with Pruitt could go. She thought through most of them in the first 2 hours, and spent the remaining 4 watching the Wyoming landscape open up and trying not to rehearse anymore, because rehearsing conversations before they happened always made her less effective in the actual conversation. Harwick Station was larger than Millstone Creek. A proper territorial hub with a marshal's office that occupied the corner of the main block, and a flagpole out front that served as orientation point. Marshal Jonas Pruitt was in his office when she arrived, a man in his early 60s, with the look of someone who had been doing this long enough to have lost all patience for the parts of the job that weren't actually about justice. He offered her coffee, which she accepted, and sat across his desk with the attentive stillness of a man who listened for a living. Nora told him what she knew. Not everything, and not in the order it had happened, but in the order that built the picture correctly, starting with Della Marsh's name and Callum's account of Broken Spur, and ending with Silas Croft in her yard asking for a private conversation. Pruitt listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a file that was thicker than she would have liked. Which meant this was not new territory for him. Della Marsh came to us 5 weeks ago. His voice had dropped into a register that was different from official, quieter, more considered. Walked in the front door and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. She gave a statement that took 4 hours to record, described the attack in detail, described the man who got her out of the cellar in detail, tall, dark hair, scar on the left jaw, tattoo on his upper chest. Said he told her his first name was Weston. Nora kept her hands still in her lap. She came to you 5 weeks ago, she said. Before the auction. Pruitt closed the file. We've been looking for Weston since then, not to charge him, to hear his account and determine his status. The warrant is for questioning, not arrest, and Silas Croft. Pruitt's expression did the thing that official expressions did when they were acknowledging something they weren't cleared to fully acknowledge. Croft is a priority for this office. We've had eyes on his movements. A pause. Miss Hale, your hired man needs to come in voluntarily and give his account. If his account matches what Delamarche gave us, which from what you've described it will, then his status changes considerably. Nora looked at the file on Pruitt's desk. He's been running for 8 months. He put himself between Croft and a woman in a cellar and took a blade across the face for it, and then ran because he knew no one would believe him. Pruitt looked at her directly. That's exactly why Delamarche walked into this office on her own and gave a 4-hour statement. She wanted someone to believe him. He set his hands flat on the desk. Bring him in, or tell him to come. Either way, I need him here, and I need it soon, because Croft is going to find out that Delamarche talked to us, and when he does, anyone connected to Weston Callum becomes a liability he'll want to eliminate. Nora rode back to Millstone Creek with Pruitt's words in her chest like stones she was carrying uphill. 6 hours gave her time to feel the full weight of the situation. Not because she hadn't expected something like this, but because knowing a thing is coming and having it fully arrive were different conditions. Delamarche had been in that office 5 weeks ago, telling the truth about a night that Callum had been carrying alone since it happened. The machinery of justice had been moving toward him this entire time and he hadn't known. He'd been in her yard fixing fence posts. She got home after dark. Callum was at the barn, securing the doors for the night, checking the latches and the hinge security the way her father had done every evening of his ranching life. She told him. All of it. In the kitchen with the lamp between them. Not the edited version she might have given someone she trusted less, but the complete account. Delamarche's statement, Pruitt's assessment, the warrant language, the 5 weeks of official machinery moving in his direction without his knowledge. She watched his face as she talked. It did not do what she expected, which was to show relief or fear or some mixture of both. It went very still. The specific stillness of someone absorbing an impact that's larger than they'd built their defenses for. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The lamp between them threw shadows that made it harder to read his expression, and she waited rather than filling the silence. His voice was rough at the edges. I didn't know if she'd been in the right condition to remember clearly. She remembered everything. Nora kept her voice level. She described the tattoo, the scar, your first name, the route you took to Red Rock Crossing. She said you talked to her the whole 2 hours to keep her conscious. Something moved through his expression that was older and deeper than anything Nora had seen cross his face in the days he'd been at the ranch. Not the efficient blankness or the controlled assessment. This was the look of a man touching a wound he'd stopped letting himself touch because touching it and having nowhere to put the feeling was worse than not touching it. She was in shock, he said. I didn't know if anything I was saying was reaching her. It reached her. Nora folded her hands on the table. You need to go to Harwick Station. He looked up. Not because Pruitt ordered you to, because it's the only move that goes anywhere. She held his gaze. You can keep running until Croft corners you somewhere, without Gus Farley's gray mare on the horizon. Or you can ride to Harwick Station and give your account to a man who already has Delamarche and is looking for the piece that connects to it. And if he decides the account isn't sufficient, then you're in no worse position than you are right now. Except you'll have tried. She paused. You told me you weren't running anymore. You told me that the first night when I said you could leave if the terms didn't suit you. I said this was worth the risk. Then take the risk that actually changes something. Callum looked at the table for a long moment. At the handkerchief folded next to the lamp which he'd set there when he came in. Then at Nora, with the direct steadiness that she'd learned was his specific version of honesty, the look that preceded what he actually meant to say. If I go, he said carefully, and something goes wrong. If Pruitt decides the evidence doesn't clear me, or if Croft has people at the station, Gus Farley will check the property twice daily. I know where the rifle is. She did not let her voice carry more or less than the situation warranted. I've been managing this ranch alone for 3 years. I can manage it for however long Harwick Station takes. His jaw tightened. That's not what I'm worried about. Nora understood what he was worried about. She understood it with the specific clarity of someone who had spent 3 years in a house that had too much room in it after the people it was built for were gone. Someone who knew exactly what it felt like to have something worth returning to appear after a long absence of such things. She understood it, and she wasn't going to say it directly, because saying it directly would be a kind of pressure she was not willing to apply to a decision this consequential. Then stop worrying about it, she said, and do what you know is right. He left before dawn. Judge Calhoun came at 7 with the paperwork formalizing the arrangement, the transfer document and the voluntary cooperation notice from Pruitt's office. 2 deputy marshals waiting at the property gate with horses already saddled. Professional men, courteous. Treating Callum with the careful neutrality of people who had read the relevant documents and were doing their job without interpretation. Calhoun handed Nora the official copies, and she watched Callum take the marshal's horse and check its gait before mounting. The same efficient assessment he applied to every piece of equipment on the ranch, unchanged in whatever condition he was managing internally. Before he mounted, he came back to where she stood on the porch. He was holding the handkerchief. "Keep this." He pressed it into her hands. The fabric was worn thin at the fold lines and warm from his grip, as a reminder that people can change when the circumstances give them room to. His eyes stayed on hers for a moment too long to be coincidence, and not long enough to be something she could act on. And as a reason, she took it. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that she didn't need a reason, that she'd stopped needing one some time ago without fully noting the moment it happened. She said, "Straight through, tell the truth. Come back." He nodded once and mounted, and the small procession moved south down the Hale Approach Road. And Nora stood on the porch and watched until the last rider disappeared past the tree line, and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the dry morning air. She stood there a few seconds more after the silence was complete. Then she went inside, put on her work shirt, and started on the day. Gus Farley arrived at mid-morning as promised. He walked the property with Nora doing the daily assessment, offered his opinion on the north pasture fence section still needing work, and helped her retension 3 lines of wire that had gone slack before riding back. His man came in the afternoon and replaced a cracked board on the barn's east wall that had been on Nora's repair list for weeks. She worked until dark, slept badly. Day 2 was quiet in the way that wasn't actually quiet. The cattle bunched near the spring, rather than spreading to graze. The herd behavior of animals registering something in the air before human instruments could. Cinder was short-tempered at the gate. Nora noted it rather than explaining it away. On the morning of the 4th day, she got a message through Gus from a contact of his near Harwick Station. Short and informational. The man had arrived. The meeting was proceeding. No complications to report. She read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, and went back to the pasture. On the evening of that same 4th day, with the light going orange over the western ridge and the ranch settling into its end-of-day sounds, Nora went into the lean-to behind the barn to check that the blankets hadn't gone damp from the weather turning. She wasn't looking for anything. She was doing what she did when her hands needed occupying and her mind was somewhere else. The lean-to was tidier than when she'd first shown it to him. The blankets folded on the cot with the precise corners of someone who had lived in conditions that required maintaining order in small spaces. His few belongings still there, which she'd known. But seeing confirmed something she hadn't let herself confirm by thinking about it directly. He'd left them here deliberately, not because he had to, because he intended to come back to them. She was about to leave when she saw the shelf. A board cut from barn scrap and secured with 2 nails along the inner wall. She hadn't seen it before because he'd built it after she showed him the space. On the shelf, the wood chisel he used for carving in the evenings, and beside it a partial figure she hadn't noticed before. Something he'd been working on when the light allowed, and she wasn't paying specific attention. She crossed to the shelf and picked it up. The figure was rough cut, not finished, but the shape was already clear. A woman on horseback, hat brim straight, shoulders set in the particular way of someone who rode long distances for practical reasons and not for pleasure. A horse under her with a broad chest and slightly heavier hindquarters than average. The proportions of a specific bay gelding she had owned for 11 years. Nora stood in the lean-to, holding an unfinished carving of herself and Cinder, and was very still for a moment that lasted longer than she tracked. Then she set it back on the shelf exactly as she'd found it, went to the barn, started work on the stalls, which needed mucking, which was always true, and always a suitable occupation for a person who needed their hands busy, while their mind was somewhere it couldn't be followed. She was finishing the last stall the following evening, the light going flat and gray through the barn doors, when Cinder made a sound. Not distress, the opposite. The low nicker he reserved for arrivals he approved of, which was a short list, and Nora was already at the barn door before she fully processed what that sound meant. Callum came through the property gate on the marshal's horse, a second horse behind him, a roan she didn't recognize, saddled and bridled and clearly not a deputy's animal. He was still wearing the same clothes he'd left in, travel-worn now. And on his chest, catching the last flat light, was a badge, a star-shaped piece of metal that hadn't been there 5 days ago. She stayed where she was and let him come to her. He dismounted at the corral gate and looked at her across the 20 feet between them. Not the cataloging sweep from the Millstone courthouse. Not the controlled assessment she'd watched him apply to fence posts and pump mechanisms and everything else on this property. This was the expression of someone who had been in a significant number of places and returned from all of them to varying degrees of welcome, and who had not previously been in any doubt about which direction was home, until now. Pruitt gave me a provisional appointment. His voice was level, but something underneath it wasn't. The specific quality of a man choosing words carefully because the wrong ones would tip something he wasn't ready to tip. Special deputy, organized crime cases, base of operations to be determined. A pause, the weight of the next words arriving before he said them. I told him I needed to ask someone about that part. Nora looked at him, at the badge, at the horse behind him with its marshal service marking, at the lean-to visible over his shoulder with its folded blankets, and its shelf, and its unfinished carving that he didn't know she'd found. She looked at him in the fading light of a Wyoming evening, with everything she'd spent 5 days managing sitting fully in her chest, and no longer requiring management. The pump's still running well, she said. The corner of his mouth moved first. Then the rest of his face followed it into something she hadn't seen before. Something that had the particular quality of returning to a self that had been in storage for a very long time. Good, he said. I'll check the pressure in the morning. He led the horses to the corral, and she went to start supper. And the Hale ranch settled into the specific quiet of a place where 2 people were moving around inside it, with the ease of people who had stopped calculating whether they belonged there. That night he told her what Pruitt had communicated about the broader timeline. 3 members of Iron Curtain's upper organization were in custody, transported to Cheyenne. 2 more were being located. The Broken Spur case was moving through formal channels with Delamarche's statement as its foundation, and Callum's account as its corroboration. The evidentiary position was strong enough for convictions. Silas Croft was still at large. Nora was washing the supper dishes when Callum said this. She did not stop washing them. Where is he? South of Millstone. Best information Pruitt has. He was at the table, the badge set beside his coffee mug, with the precise care of a man who made a distinction between the working day and the table in this kitchen. Edwin Rourke is with him. She had heard Rourke's name in Pruitt's office, a figure above Croft in the Iron Curtain structure, sufficiently removed from direct operations that the territorial warrants hadn't yet reached him. His presence with Croft meant the organization's surviving leadership had consolidated into one place, which Pruitt had described as either an opportunity or a signal that they were planning something final.
Possibly men.
How many both?
Men?
6 confirmed, possibly 8. Nora set the last dish on the rack and dried her hands and looked out at the dark yard. The pump was a shadow, and the barn was a larger shadow, and the fence line was invisible, but present the way things you'd built always were, felt rather than seen. Pruitt knows they're coming here. He knows it's the logical move. The flatness in Callum's voice was the flatness of facts rather than defeat. I'm the piece Croft needs to remove and I'm here. He paused. Pruitt is sending deputies positioned in the area by Tuesday. That's 2 days, yes. Nora turned from the window. What aren't you telling me? He looked at her with the expression that preceded honesty he'd have preferred to deliver differently. Tuesday is the best estimate based on movement patterns. Could be Monday, could be tonight. She absorbed that, nodded once. Then we treat it like tonight. She moved the rifle to the window position, the angle that covered the approach road and the yard and the barn entrance from a single standing point. Drew the curtain to leave a viewing gap, checked the load. Callum checked his own sidearm, the marshal's Colt that Pruitt had issued along with the badge, handling it with the ease of someone who'd been carrying firearms since before Nora knew him. They did not discuss what had given him that ease. She had understood early that this was how he managed the distance between what he'd been and what he was becoming. Applying the skills the wrong life had given him to right purposes without narrating the transition. Efficient, and she thought, not so different from how she'd managed the ranch through 3 years of losing ground. By doing the next necessary thing rather than cataloging the losses. She sent Gus Farley a message the next morning through his man on the north fence. Short and specific. Croft is moving. Possible arrival within 48 hours. If you see riders from the south on the main road, send word immediately. Monday was quiet in the way that wasn't actually quiet. The cattle bunched near the spring again, rather than spreading. Cinder was short-tempered at the gate for the second day running. The kind of morning where everything that had a pulse was reading something that hadn't yet arrived in the air. Nora noted every piece of it and did not explain any of it away. Callum worked the property with one eye on the south road at all times. She watched him do this without making it obvious that she was watching. The way he positioned himself at each task site to maximize the sight line toward the approach. The way every movement had a secondary efficiency built into it. She did the same. They moved around the property in unconscious coordination, overlapping sight lines, covering angles the other's position didn't hold, a pattern that had developed without discussion, and now operated like something practiced. The cattle were still bunched at sunset. She stood at the kitchen window after supper, watching the dark come down over the south road, a smooth and total dark without a lamp or a fire visible in any direction, and thought about $2 silver and what they'd purchased. Not just the labor, not just the fence posts and the pump pressure, and the water running clean again through the housing her father had installed when she was too small to understand what a water table was, or why it mattered. Something else, something that didn't have a ledger entry, but sat in the lean-to behind the barn, on a shelf built from scrap wood and expressed itself in the proportions of a bay gelding, carved from a piece of timber on quiet evenings. A person could trade everything they had and still not purchase that. It arrived by different means entirely. By the specific mathematics of two people in the same yard long enough to stop calculating each other and start simply being in the same space. She thought about what her father would have said about that. He had been a man who believed in the arithmetic of character, not what a person claimed to be, but what they did when the doing cost something. Callum came in from his final check of the barn doors and set his hat on the peg by the kitchen entry and washed his hands at the basin without being told. The small automaticity of a person who had started taking up space in a house, as though they'd always intended to stay in it. He sat down at the table, looked at her. "You're not going to sleep tonight either," he said. "Probably not. Then we might as well be useful about it." They sat at the table in the kitchen lamp's reach, and went over the property's angles the way a commanding officer went over ground before a battle. Not with maps, with what they both knew from walking it. The barn loft, the south corner. The east fence line with its 3 sections that had been repaired and its 2 sections that hadn't. The approach road sight lines from both the house and the lean-to. The west side of the property, where the land dropped toward the drainage ditch that followed the curve of Milson Creek. Cinder made a sound at some point past midnight. Not the alarm sound, not yet. Just a low, considering sound. The sound of a horse registering something at the edge of his awareness that hadn't resolved into anything definite. Nora was at the window before Callum spoke. "Not yet," he said, "but close." She kept the lamp lit and low, and the rifle inside the viewing gap of the curtain, and watched the south road and thought about $2 silver worn smooth by 3 generations of Hale women. And what exactly it meant to spend your last luck on something and have the something turn out to be worth considerably more than what you'd paid for it. Worth every coin. Worth every risk. Worth the 5 days she'd spent managing alone in a house that had too much room in it, waiting for the sound of a horse coming through a gate. The night held its breath, and somewhere out on the south road, moving in the dark with the practiced quiet of men who had done this before, Silas Croft was counting down whatever distance remained between his purpose and the Hale property line. The accounting, he'd called it. Not a threat, a calendar entry. Nora understood calendars. She'd been reading them her whole life. 4 months and the bank comes calling. 3 years and the pasture count drops from 300 to 30. 2 coins and the gavel comes down, and everything that happens next happens whether you're ready for it or not. She was ready for it. The signal came from the cattle. Not from Cinder this time. From the herd itself, the way animals moved when something was wrong in the air before human instruments could name it. Nora had checked the far pasture at sunset and found them bunched tight at the spring rather than spreading to graze. 31 head pressed shoulder to shoulder in the specific formation they held when a predator had passed through, recently enough to leave a scent. She'd stood at the spring's edge and read that formation the way her father had taught her to read it, and come back to the house, knowing Tuesday had become tonight. Callum was already at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low when she came in. He'd moved the Colt from its holster to the table surface, close but not drawn, the way a working man set down a tool he expected to need again shortly. He looked at her face when she entered and didn't ask what she'd seen because her face had already told him. East approach or south, he said. Both. They'll split. He nodded once and stood, and they moved through the house in the near dark, checking the positions they'd already discussed, the angles they'd already mapped. Nora took the rifle from the window position and checked the load she'd already checked twice that afternoon. The checking wasn't about the load. It was about having something purposeful to do with her hands while the rest of her was very still and listening. Past midnight the property went quiet in a way that wasn't quiet. The cattle sounds had stopped. The pump ran its steady thread of sound in the background, and then even that seemed to recede as the specific anticipatory silence of the hour before something happened settled over the Hale land like weather. Cinder made a sound. One note, low and hard and nothing like his usual vocabulary, the sound of an animal that had resolved something from a sensory input into a confirmed threat and was reporting the conclusion. Nora was at the back door before the sound finished. The cold hit her as she stepped onto the rear porch. October dark and total, no moon, the stars the only reference. She stood absolutely still and let her ears do the work her eyes couldn't. Horses, south and east simultaneously, controlled pace, men trying for quiet and achieving something close to it but not close enough, because dry ground in Wyoming carried differently than anywhere else, and she had been reading this specific ground for 31 years. Callum materialized at her left shoulder without sound. He had crossed the yard in the dark, and she had not heard him do it, which told her something about what he'd been before the tattoo and the shackles and the courthouse in Millstone, and she filed that information where she filed everything she understood about him, which was in the part of herself that had already made its decisions about him and wasn't revisiting them. 8 riders, he said, barely above breath. South and east, he split them. 2 simultaneous directions meant no single position could answer both. Nora thought through the geometry of the property in 3 seconds, the way her father had thought through drought calculations, fast and without sentiment, and arrived at the barn loft. Because the loft gave her the east approach and the yard in one sight line. Because the boards her father had never gotten around to closing left a gap wide enough to aim through and narrow enough to shelter behind. Because Silas Croft's men would look for her at ground level, where they expected a woman to be, and being where they didn't expect her was the only advantage she had, and she intended to use it completely. She went for the barn. Callum moved toward the house's south corner to hold the main approach. She trusted that absolutely. Not as a calculation, as something already settled. The loft ladder took 12 seconds. She'd counted it that afternoon. She positioned herself at the gap and let her breathing slow and watched the gray that was beginning, barely beginning, at the eastern edge of the sky. Not enough light to see details. Enough to resolve shapes against shapes if you knew what you were looking for. They came over the east fence first. Wire cutters, not the gate, the snap of the wire carrying sharp and clean in the still air. 2 riders through the east cut. 3 more through the main south gate and fanning immediately west around the barn. She tracked a 3rd group from a different angle than she'd anticipated and revised her count upward. Not 8. More. Croft had brought enough to be certain. A voice from the yard, pitched to carry without shouting. the professional volume of a man who had done this before and knew exactly how loud was necessary. "Miss Hale, we have no quarrel with you. Send Callum out. This ends here." Silence from the house. Because Callum wasn't in the house. Because the men in the yard didn't know that yet. Last chance to keep this simple. Nora lined up on the fence post directly in front of the man nearest the barn door. Not at him, 6 inches left of his boot. She took a breath, held the exhale, and squeezed. The post exploded into splinters and the yard stopped being a standoff. Motion everywhere at once. Men dropping to positions, guns clearing leather. The geometry of the yard suddenly a rapid calculation problem of angles and distances and decisions happening faster than language. But motion without a plan was not the same as control. And in the 3 seconds when every man in the yard was adjusting, and none of them were watching the barn's south corner, Callum came around it, not in retreat. At an angle that cut off the 2 riders on the east approach before they could add their numbers to the men already inside the fence line. What happened at the south corner resolved quickly. Both men down, not dead, because Callum moved on immediately and men dealing with the dead required more time. These 2 would stand eventually, not in the next several minutes. She redirected to the 3 men who had pinpointed her loft position and were moving toward an angle where they could simply fire the barn below her and solve the problem that way. She didn't give them time to reach it. 2 controlled shots, aimed at movement rather than men, driving them back toward the fence line, buying distance and seconds, and the continued existence of a barn her father had built with his own hands in 1861. And then from the north gate came horses at full gallop. Gus Farley came through the Hale gate with the complete recklessness of a man who had been waiting for a signal and had decided he was done waiting for it. 2 riders with him she didn't immediately identify. And behind them 2 more whose posture and equipment marked them as men professionally prepared for exactly this kind of morning. Pruitt's deputies, arriving at the moment the geometry needed them. And she would think later that Gus Farley's timing was not luck, but the result of a man who had ranched next to the Hale land for 22 years and knew every sound this property made and what each one meant. The yard's arithmetic recalculated, not simply in favor of one side, but into something else entirely, into enough. Enough covered positions, enough angles held, enough men who knew what they were doing that Croft's assault became something other than the conclusion he had designed it to be. 2 of his men broke for the east fence. 1 went down before he cleared it. The other made the wire and kept riding, and Nora let him go, because a man running away from her land was not her problem to chase. Edwin Rourke came out of the barn's east side with his gun already raised. Callum's shot took him in the shoulder, and Rourke went down the way a man went down when the structural support of an arm was suddenly removed, hard and total, and without grace. He lay in the dirt and made sounds but did not move toward his weapon, which was the relevant fact, and Nora filed it as dealt with and kept scanning. From the south edge of the property, Croft's voice came, finally carrying something beneath its professional level, the specific quality of a man watching his plan come apart in real time and making the rapid calculation of what remained available to him. Pull back to the road. What happened next happened fast. Croft's men moved in the manner of professionals whose certainty had been the plan, and the plan was gone. Not panic, but the undisciplined motion of men who had stopped believing in the outcome. Callum moved through that condition like water through broken ground, finding the gaps that opened when certainty collapsed, finding the men looking at each other instead of their positions, finding the hesitations. He was not trying to kill anyone. Nora understood this watching from the loft, because a deputy marshal who killed men in flight occupied a different legal and practical position than a deputy marshal who controlled men in flight, and he had thought through this distinction before the first shot was fired, and was applying it now, in real time, with a shoulder that was not fully functional. She registered the way his left arm compensated for something, filed it, kept scanning. Gus Farley's riders held the east fence. Pruitt's 2 deputies controlled the road position, cutting off the retreat south, so that the retreat became something else, became a capture. And the men still calculating odds, stopped calculating when they looked at the road and found it occupied. Croft broke west, not toward the road, across open ground toward the drainage ditch that ran along the property's western edge, following the curl of Millstone Creek, a route that avoided both the road and Gus Farley's position. A route that required knowing the terrain well enough to know it existed. He had done his reconnaissance. She gave him that. She heard the west fence wire and had the rifle on him in the same moment, and he was 50 yards out and moving fast, and she knew the shot and knew she could make it, and she chose not to take it. Because he was leaving her land. Because she had asked for that in every encounter in this yard, implicitly and explicitly. The simple boundary of a woman who wanted to be left alone to work her own ground. And shooting a man in the back, as he cleared her fence line, was something she could do, and something she would not do. And the distance between those two positions was the same distance between who she was and who Silas Croft had always been, and she had no intention of closing it. From the north, on the secondary road that connected to the main territorial route without passing through Millstone, 2 riders came at full gallop, with marshal service badges catching the early light. Pruitt had sent 4 deputies. The second pair had taken the north road and positioned themselves at the drainage approach specifically, which meant Pruitt had known this terrain too, or had taken the time to learn it, which was why he was still doing this job in his 60s, while lesser men had retired or been buried. Croft pulled his horse to a stop at the drainage edge, a man counting his remaining options and arriving at a number he didn't like. He looked at the riders from the north. Looked back at the yard where 8 months of planning had concluded without the conclusion he'd intended. Looked at the drainage below him, which was neither deep enough to cross usefully, nor wide enough to serve as cover. He dropped his sidearm into the water, raised both hands. Nora lowered the rifle. The yard held the specific quiet of a place where the shooting has stopped, and the people still on their feet are taking inventory of themselves and each other. Gus's rider was checking the man near the trough. Gus himself had dismounted and was already in conversation with one of Pruitt's deputies. The compressed information exchange of men who needed to establish facts quickly. Callum was at the barn's south corner with the Colt holstered, and his left arm held at a careful angle that told her everything she needed to know about the shoulder. She came down from the loft. She walked the property the way her father walked it after every bad storm, methodically, without hurry, looking at what the morning had changed and what it hadn't. The east fence was cut and would need repair. One morning's work. The water trough had taken a round through its east face and would leak until she patched it. The post she'd blown apart was structurally sound beneath the cosmetic damage. The barn stood intact. The house had not been reached. The pump housing sat untouched behind the house, running its clean and steady sound into the morning air, exactly as it had run every morning since Callum fixed the filter housing in the dark 8 weeks ago. She stood at the barn door and looked at all of it. Felt the anger first, the specific anger of someone whose land had been made into a battlefield by people who had no claim on it. And underneath the anger, something quieter and more durable. The particular relief of a person who had known something was coming, had prepared for it honestly, and was still standing on her own ground with the cattle visible in the far pasture, and the sky going from gray to the pale specific blue of a Wyoming morning that intended to be decent, repairable. That was the word she held. The deputies brought Croft in from the drainage on foot, his horse led behind him. He walked with the same composure he had carried through every previous encounter on this property. The composure of a man who had decided that how he conducted himself in defeat was the last thing that remained entirely his to control. When he crossed the yard, his eyes found Nora, and she met them without stepping back and held them long enough to make the point. Not a point about victory, a point about ground. Her ground, still standing, and the man who had spent 8 months trying to take what it contained now walking across it, under someone else's authority with his hands bound behind him. She released the look first and went to find Gus Farley. Della Marsh was standing near the barn. Nora had not known she was coming. The message through Pruitt had not mentioned it, which meant either Pruitt hadn't known, or he had left the decision entirely to Della, which seemed precisely like the kind of thing Pruitt would do. A man who understood that some moments belonged to the people who had earned them, and not to the officials who had facilitated them. Della was perhaps 50. Straight-backed, in the particular this way of people who had trained themselves to stand straight through things that would have permanently bent others, and had done it long enough that the straightness had become structural rather than effortful. She had the quality of presence that came from surviving catastrophe, without building the survival into the center of her identity. A woman who had lost 7 people she loved in a single night, and had gotten up the following morning and continued to be a person in the world, and who had walked into a federal marshal's office 5 weeks ago, with 4 hours of testimony, and no guarantee of what it would cost her. She looked at Callum, when he came around the barn's corner, and saw her. Looked at him the way people looked at something they had carried in memory for a long time, and were now setting beside the reality, to check where the two versions matched and where they didn't. Weston. Her voice was level in the way of something thought through many times before being said aloud. I told them everything I remembered. I needed you to hear that from me directly. Callum went still. I told them about the cellar door. She held his gaze without effort. I told them what you said when you got me onto the horse. I told them you talked to me the entire 2 hours in the dark to Red Rock Crossing. A pause that had weight in it, rather than hesitation. I don't know if you knew that was the thing keeping me together. His jaw tightened before the words came. You were in shock. I didn't know if anything I was saying was reaching you. It reached me. She extended her hand. All of it reached me. He took her hand, and they shook with the gravity of 2 people who had shared a catastrophe from different positions, and survived it separately and were now in a yard in Wyoming on a cold October morning with a federal deputy walking a prisoner 20 feet away, and Gus Farley standing at a respectful distance with his hat in his hands, acknowledging all of that without needing to narrate it. Then Della released his hand and turned to Nora with an assessment that was direct and without performance. You came to Pruitt. He needed to know what I knew. Della was quiet for a moment. Then your father was Elias Hale. The name landed the way it always did when someone outside the family carried it into a conversation, with a weight that had nothing to do with volume. My husband knew him by reputation. Said he was the kind of man who stopped when other people kept riding. She looked between Nora and Callum, at the yard with its evidence of the morning, at the Hale property standing intact behind all of it, the barn and the house and the pump running its clean sound in the background, and the fence broken in one place and nowhere else. It appears, Della said, that ran in the family. She left without ceremony and without waiting for acknowledgement, moving toward Pruitt's deputy, who was managing the documentation. A woman who had delivered what she came to deliver and was done waiting for anything. Nora stood at the barn door and held the weight of that sentence. Her father's name, his reputation, which was the only inheritance she'd actually received, and the only one that had turned out to matter when it needed to. The kind of man who stopped when other people kept riding. And here was what 3 decades of that stopping had accumulated into. Through his life and through hers, and through a chain of small decisions by people who hadn't known they were building anything together. Gus Farley appeared at her side with 2 mugs of coffee he had somehow produced from her kitchen without being asked, which was so completely characteristic of him that she felt something loosen in her chest at the sheer familiarity of it. Property's mostly sound, he said, handing her a mug. East fence is a morning's work. Truff needs a patch. He stood beside her and drank his own coffee, and surveyed the yard with the expression of a man who had watched Wyoming land absorb considerable amounts of human difficulty and remain land. After a while, your father would have found this entire situation extremely interesting. He would have shown up at the gate with a full pot and asked too many questions. He would have. Gus finished his mug, set it on the fence rail. I'll bring my man back for the fence tomorrow. He paused with his hand on his horse's bridle. You did right, Nora, start to finish. Then he mounted and rode north. After the prisoners were processed, and Pruitt's deputies had their paperwork complete, and Rourke had been helped onto a horse by 2 men and Gus had ridden north with the promise of tomorrow's fence work, the Hale property settled into a silence that was different from every silence that had preceded it. Not the held-breath silence of before the fight. Not the watchful silence of waiting for Croft to appear. Something new. The silence of a place where a thing that had been building for a long time had finally concluded. And what remained was simply what had always been there underneath it. Callum brought wood in for the stove without being asked. Nora noticed immediately the way he carried it, right arm doing the main work, left arm compensating with a careful restriction in the shoulder that hadn't been there yesterday. Sit down, she said. It's nothing. Wade, his first name, used for the second time in their acquaintance. The effect was the same as the first time. A quality of attention that shifted in a way she couldn't describe except to say it was the opposite of the courthouse assessment. a man being fully seen rather than doing the seeing. He set the wood down and unfastened his shirt at the shoulder. The wound was a furrow across the top of the left shoulder, clean through, the kind that bled considerably before clotting and then stopped being an emergency while remaining genuinely painful. The fabric around it was stiff with dried blood she hadn't noticed during the fight, because other things had required her attention more urgently. She cleaned it without commentary. Her father's medical kit had lived in the kitchen cabinet for 20 years of ranching accidents, and was stocked with the practical specificity of a man who understood that help was an hour away at minimum and self-sufficiency was not optional. She worked with the focused efficiency she brought to pump mechanisms and fence wire, the same quality of attention to a practical problem, requiring practical solution. When she finished wrapping it, she set her hands flat on either side of the kit and let out a breath she had been managing since before dawn. "You took that during the south corner," she said. "I was aware of it somewhat after the fact. I saw it from the loft." She looked at him steadily. "You kept moving. Stopping wasn't going to help the situation." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the conversation. Then she put the kit away and started supper. And he stayed at the table, and they moved around the kitchen in the easy coordination that had developed without either of them designing it. Two people who had learned each other's patterns in the course of shared work, until the patterns had become a kind of language, spoken without words. They ate on the porch because the evening had gone cold and clear, the sky doing what Wyoming skies did in the deep fall when the air was dry enough to make the stars look close enough to name. The yard below was settled and quiet. The barn doors latched. The cattle had returned to their normal spread in the far pasture, now that the thing that had disturbed them was gone. The pump ran its small, clean line of sound in the background. Callum set his plate down and looked at the south road for a long moment, the road that had brought Silas Croft to this property 3 times across 8 months and would not bring him again. "Pruitt's written offer came through before I left Harwick Station." His voice had the particular quality of a man who had been carrying something and was setting it down carefully. "I didn't mention it until now because I wanted to see what the day looked like first." Nora waited. "SEF station designation for the property. Federal operational support. Formal arrangement for witness transit. Resource allocation covering maintenance and equipment." A pause. "It covers the banknote." She was quiet a moment. The banknote. 4 months, the letter had said when all of this began. 4 months to find a solution or lose everything 3 generations of Hales had built on this ground. She had found a solution that bore no resemblance to anything she would have designed if she'd been given the choice. "That's not why I did any of it," she said, "because it needed to be spoken plainly. I know it isn't. No qualification. No pause before it. And it's not why I'm asking. You haven't asked yet." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I'm working toward it." She looked out at the dark property. The fence line invisible but present. The way things you've built were always present, even when you couldn't see them. The pump she could hear. The barn her father had built, and her mother had planted climbing roses against the south wall. Roses that had spent 3 years without management, and were now thorny and dense and apparently beyond killing. She thought about what it meant to have something that had started as a transaction of 2 coins, and the absence of any better option becomes something with weight and direction and texture, something that had not been purchasable at any price, because it had arrived through a different mechanism entirely, through the specific accumulation of days and work, and the small recurring gestures of people who had stopped calculating whether to be present and simply were. "The arrangement with Pruitt," she said. "How long?" "Minimum 2 years, renewable, and you. Specifically you, not the arrangement." He looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was his particular form of certainty, the expression that appeared when he had cleared everything uncertain from the question and arrived somewhere solid. "I'd like to be here considerably longer than the federal contract requires." A beat. The weight of the next words arriving before he said them. "I'd like to make that a permanent question if you're open to being asked it properly." Nora was quiet for long enough that a less patient man might have pulled back from it. Callum was not a less patient man. He had waited 2 hours on a dark road in October to deliver a woman to safety, and never once asked for acknowledgement. He could wait for this. "My family had a custom," she said. "Ask twice. Once to be certain you mean it. Wants to be certain the answer hasn't changed. Then I'm asking the first time now. She turned to look at him in the porch lamplight. This man who had come to her property in iron shackles with a feared tattoo, and 2 coins worth of anyone's faith, and who had taken apart her water supply in the dark at 2 in the morning, because he couldn't sleep, and figured he might as well be useful, and who had carved a woman on horseback from barn scrap on his evenings, and left it on a shelf in a lean-to as the quietest declaration she had ever received, and who had taken a bullet across the shoulder in her yard that morning, and kept moving, because stopping wasn't going to help the situation. Ask again in the spring, she said, after the east fence is done, and you've seen what the north pasture looks like when the water's been right for a full season. She picked up her coffee. If you still want to ask, I'll still want to answer. They sat on the porch until the cold made staying impractical, and then they went inside, and the Hale ranch settled into the specific quiet of a place where 2 people are moving around in it, with the ease of people who have stopped considering whether they belong there. Callum asked again in March. The north pasture had greened for the first time in 3 years, a real green, not the thin, hopeful green of a pasture barely surviving, but the deep, settled green of ground that had been watered properly through a full season. Cinder stood at the corral gate with his ears forward and his eyes on the middle distance, the posture of a horse who was simply satisfied with the morning and not reporting any concerns. The pump ran its clean and steady sound all the way to the porch. Callum asked it plainly, standing in the yard with his hat in his hand, and the March light going long and gold across the Hale land, in the manner of a man who had said it once and knew the answer, and was completing a custom because the custom mattered. Nora said yes the same way, plainly. In the yard where she had stood on the morning she'd spent her last 2 coins, and had not yet known what those coins were actually purchasing. They were married the following Saturday at the Millstone Creek Courthouse. Judge Calhoun presided. The same bench, the same room, the same morning light coming through the east windows that had fallen on 60 people, the day Nora had stood up with $2 silver and changed the direction of both their lives. The room was not full this time, but it was not empty. Gus Farley was there with Ruth and their man from the north fence, and 2 families from the valley who had watched the Hale property hold through October and drawn their own conclusions about the people who had held it. Marshal Jonas Pruitt had ridden from Harwick Station and sat in the back row with his hat on his knee, and the expression of a man who considered this outcome professionally satisfying and personally gratifying, and saw no reason to conceal either. Gus Farley stood in for Nora's father and shook Callum's hand for a long time afterward without saying a word, which was Gus Farley's highest register of approval, and had always been understood as such by anyone who knew him. Ruth Farley held Nora's hands in both of hers and said quietly that Elias would have been proud, and Nora said she believed that was true, and that was sufficient. Callum wore his badge because it was a working day and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. It sat on his chest, where the tattoo sat beneath his shirt, and both of those things were true about him simultaneously, and always would be, and he had stopped needing that to resolve into something simpler. Nora wore her mother's dress, which fit better than expected, and carried nothing borrowed because she was a Hale, and Hales had always managed with what they had, and what they had always turned out to be enough. Calhoun read the words. They said the words back. Calhoun signed the document. They signed the document, and in the signing the Hale ranch acquired its 2nd permanent resident, and the woman who had sat on the courthouse steps 8 months ago with cold coffee and a letter from the bank, and 2 coins, worn smooth by 3 generations of women's hands, became, in the official record of Millstone Creek Territorial Courthouse, Nora Hale Callum. They rode home in the afternoon, with the March light going amber over the western ridge, and the road dry for the first time since the previous October, and the distance between the courthouse and the Hale property felt different than it ever had in the 31 years she had traveled it. Not shorter and not longer, but simply inhabited in a way it hadn't been before. 6 months after that, the property had a federal placard at the east gate, and a small operational addition on the barn's south side that Callum had built himself across 3 weeks in early summer. He had planed the boards smooth and fitted the roof with a proper pitch, and hung the door level on its hinges, and set the windows at angles that caught the morning light. The work of a man building something he intended to still be standing long after he was. which was, Nora had come to understand, how he approached everything he built on this land. Each fence post set with the attention of a person who believed the fence needed to last. Each repair made as though permanence were the only acceptable outcome. She was 4 months along by the time the addition was finished. She had known for 8 weeks before telling him. On a Tuesday evening in September, with the supper dishes done, and the lamp between them on the kitchen table, she told him plainly and without preamble, the way she had learned he received important information best. His face did the thing it had learned to do across the months of their life together on this property, the thing that was not the shadow of an expression, or the approach to one, but the full and unguarded version of a man who has stopped calculating what he is permitted to feel and is simply feeling it. He put his hand over hers on the table and held it there for a long moment without speaking. Then, his voice carrying the particular roughness it carried when something had reached somewhere past the careful architecture of his self-containment, June. If she's a girl, after the month when everything changed. Nora looked at his hand over hers on the table that had been her mother's, looked at the badge beside the coffee mug, looked at the handkerchief folded on the shelf above the fireplace, where she'd placed it the day he came back from Harwick Station. Not put away but kept, the way you kept the objects that marked where you had started, so you could occasionally take stock of how far the road had run. June, she said. Outside in the long September light, the Hale property was doing what it had been built to do across 3 generations. The cattle stood at 91 head from the 30 she had counted on the morning she rode to Millstone with 2 coins in her pocket. The fence held on all 4 sides. The pump ran with the full clean pressure of a mechanism properly maintained, its sound carrying across the dry grass to the house in the particular way that sound carried when nothing was failing and nothing was wanting. Callum came in from the north pasture check and hung his hat and washed his hands and sat down at the table with the ease of a man who had become native to this kitchen through the specific process of showing up in it every day, until showing up had stopped being a choice and become simply where he was. He looked at her hands resting quiet on the table, at the particular stillness of a woman who was letting herself simply be somewhere rather than managing the being of it. "Pasture fence is holding," he said. "Good." He looked at the handkerchief on the shelf, at the tobacco tin beside it where the 2 Morgan dollars lived now, returned by Judge Calhoun when the auction contract was vacated in the federal proceedings. Back in Hale hands as though they had never left. They had done what coins were built to do. Now they were something else. The kind of object you took out occasionally to hold and set back down, to show, eventually, to the people who came after you when those people were ready to understand that some things carried weight beyond their material, beyond any price a gavel could establish on a Tuesday morning in October. With 60 people watching and a man in iron shackles, standing on a platform, and a woman reaching into her pocket for the last thing she had. "I've been thinking about something," Callum said. Nora waited. The carving, in the lean-to. He looked at the table. "I know you told him. How long have you known?" You said it back at a slightly different angle. The corner of his mouth moved. "I notice things." "You do," she agreed. He looked up at her. "I never finished it, I know. I'd like to finish it now." His eyes stayed on hers, "If that's all right." Outside the pump ran its clean and steady sound into the autumn air. The cattle moved through the north pasture unhurried, the sound of them carrying on the dry Wyoming air to the kitchen window. The handkerchief sat on its shelf, and the coins sat in their tin, and the carving sat in the lean-to unfinished and waiting. A woman on horseback rendered in wood by a man who had noticed her before she'd noticed him noticing. "That's all right," Nora said, and the Hale ranch held its ground, the way it had always held its ground, the way she had always held her ground, because that was what ground was for. And she had always known it, and now she did not hold it alone.